The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a death rattle for a family's dream. It cut through the crisp November air of 1982, sharp and cold as the steel it was selling. I stood at the back of the crowd, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford pickup, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas coat. I wasn't here to buy, I was here to watch, to remember. Every farmer in 3 counties who wasn't already broke was here, picking over the bones of the Miller place. Good people, the Millers. Young Tom Miller had tried to do it right, or at least what the bank and the magazines told him was right. He'd gone all in. Now his gleaming emerald green John Deere 4840, not even 3 years old, was on the block. The cab glass shone in the weak afternoon sun, a cruel joke. Inside that sound-guard body was a world of quiet comfort Tom would never know again. The auctioneer chanted its virtues: quad range, 3 remotes, full rack of weights, but all I could see was the crushing weight of the note that came with it. Next to me, Old Man Hemlock spat a stream of tobacco juice that froze almost before it hit the ground. "Look at 'em," he grumbled, his voice like gravel in a coffee can, "vultures on a gut pile." He wasn't wrong. But we were all just trying to survive. The crowd was a mix of faces. There were the nervous ones, their own balance sheets teetering on the same knife's edge as the Millers. There were the predators, men with cash from a good year or an inheritance looking to expand on the cheap. And then there were men like me, the quiet ones, the ones who'd been called fools for years. The 4840 went for $42,000, a steal. A man I didn't know, with a new money swagger and a clean Stetson, signed the slip. Tom Miller, standing by the farmhouse porch with his wife, didn't even flinch. He just looked hollowed out, like one of his own cornstalks after the picker had gone through. The auctioneer moved on to the combine, an International 1460. Then the planter, the disc, the chisel plow. Each piece a monument to a loan officer's optimism and a farmer's hope. Each sale another nail in the coffin. It was a scene playing out all over the heartland that year. Interest rates were choking us, soaring to 18, 20, even 21%. Commodity prices were in the tank. The land boom of the 70s had turned into a bust, and the equity we'd all thought we had was nothing but smoke. My neighbor, Dale Peterson, was there, standing near the front. He wasn't bidding, just watching with a smug look on his face. Dale was the king of the coffee shop, the man who always had the newest, biggest machine. He'd been the first in the county with a 4-wheel drive Steiger, then traded it for an even bigger Versatile. He farmed 1,000 acres he didn't own, all of it on the bank's dime. He looked at the Miller's misfortune not as a warning, but as confirmation of his own genius. He thought Tom had just been a bad manager. As the auctioneer started on the smaller items, shop tools, hay racks, a tired old Ford 8N that probably hadn't run in a decade, my mind drifted back. Back to a different time, a different feeling. Back to 1974, the 70s had started with a roar. Nixon had opened up trade, and the Russians were buying grain like it was going out of style. Prices shot up. For the first time in a long time, there was real money to be made in farming. And with money came the temptation to spend it. That was the year I bought the Big Bud. It wasn't new, not even close. It was a 1972 HN 320, built up in Havre, Montana, by men who understood what real power was. It had a Cummins N855 engine, a straight-six diesel that displaced 855 cubic inches. No turbo, just raw, naturally aspirated muscle that put out 320 horsepower at the flywheel. It was a simple, brutal machine. The frame was made of 1-inch thick welded steel plate. The axles were Clark planetaries, the kind you'd find on a mining scraper. The transmission was a Fuller 9-speed manual. No synchros, no fancy power shift. You had to double clutch it like a real truck driver, and if you missed a gear on a hard pull, you'd come to a dead stop. I found it sitting on a dealer's backlot in western Nebraska. The original owner had traded it for a new Steiger with all the bells and whistles. The Bud looked ancient next to the new iron. Its paint was faded, a chalky white with a few dings and scrapes. The cab was just a steel box with glass, no insulation, no radio, just a simple heater that barely kept up on a cold day. But I walked around it, tapping the frame, looking at the clean oil on the dipstick, and I knew. This was a forever machine. I'd had 3 good years in a row. My land, the 480 acres my grandfather had homesteaded, was paid for. My wife Helen and I lived simply. We didn't owe a soul. I had the cash saved up in a coffee can in the back of our closet. I paid the dealer $28,000 and drove that monster home myself, 150 miles across the state line. It took me 2 days. The roar of that big Cummins was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Dale Peterson saw it the day I brought it home. He pulled into my yard in his brand new pickup, a cloud of dust behind him. He was on his way back from the John Deere dealer, where he'd just signed the papers on a new 4630. He walked over, kicking one of the big Bud's massive 24.5 32 tires. "What in God's name is that thing, Art?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a big Bud," I said, wiping grease from my hands. 320 horse. "Looks like something they built in a blacksmith shop," he scoffed. "No power shift? No air conditioning? Hell, the cab on my new 4630 is quieter than my wife's living room. Got an AM/FM radio with an 8-track player. This one will pull a 30-foot chisel plow without breaking a sweat," I said quietly. "Yeah, if you can find parts for it," he shot back. "And if you can stand the noise. I'm telling you, Art, you're living in the past. Comfort, efficiency, dealer support, that's the future. You got to use your credit, leverage your assets. That's how you get ahead." He patted the hood of his new truck. "The bank manager told me himself. Said I was a progressive farmer." He drove off, leaving me there with my old junk. I knew what he and the others were saying about me at the co-op. That Art Jensen was too cheap, too scared. That he'd inherited a paid-for farm and was just going to sit on it until it withered away. They didn't understand. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about being free. Every machine in my shed, my trusty John Deere 4020, my old Gleaner F combine, my International M for raking hay, they were all mine. They didn't belong to the bank. When I turned the key, I was the only man I had to answer to. That big Bud was just the newest, biggest piece of that freedom. Before we go any further, I want to ask you folks something. Have you ever known a man like Art who stuck to his guns with old iron while everyone else was running to the bank? Or maybe you knew a Dale who couldn't resist that new tractor smell? Let me know down in the comments which one you've seen more of in your life. I'm curious to know if my little corner of the world was the only one with men like that. That first fall with the big Bud was a revelation. I hooked it to my 21-foot International disc chisel, a heavy beast of an implement that made my 4020 grunt and groan in third gear. The big Bud didn't even know it was back there. I dropped it in the ground a full 10 inches, put the throttle to the floor, and let that big Cummins sing its song. The ground just peeled back like the lid on a tin can. I covered more acres in a day than I used to in 3. The machine was a brute, honest and straightforward, but it wasn't without its quirks. The second spring I owned it, I was out dissing the corn stalks ahead of the planter when disaster struck. I was halfway across the biggest field on the place, a mile from the road, when there was a loud bang, a shudder that shook the whole 12-ton tractor, and a sudden loss of all hydraulic power. The disc dropped to the ground, digging in deep, and the steering wheel went limp in my hands. I wrestled the transmission out of gear and shut down the engine. The silence that followed was terrifying. I climbed down from the cab, my heart pounding in my chest. A river of hydraulic fluid was pouring out from under the belly of the tractor, soaking into the black dirt. I crawled underneath, the smell of hot oil filling my nostrils. It was worse than I thought. A main pressure line, one of the big 1-inch hoses that fed the steering and the remote valves, had rubbed against the frame. Over hundreds of hours of vibration, it had worn a weak spot, and the 2200 psi of pressure had done the rest. It had exploded. There was no calling the dealer for a mobile service truck. The big Bud dealer was 3 states away, and they probably didn't have the part for a machine this old anyway. This was on me. I walked the mile back to the house, feeling every step. Helen saw the look on my face when I came through the door. "What's wrong, Art?" The Bud blew a main hydraulic line. It's dead in the water in the middle of the back 80. She didn't panic. She just poured me a cup of coffee. "Well," she said, "what do you need to fix it?" That was the question. I spent the rest of the day on the phone. I called parts houses in Omaha, Des Moines, Kansas City. Nobody had a pre-formed hose for an HN 320. They acted like I was asking for a part for a steam engine. Finally, I got a hold of a heavy equipment salvage yard south of Lincoln. The old fella on the phone knew the machine. "Yep, got one of them sitting out back," he rasped. "Been there 5 years. Tell you what, son, you come pull the hose yourself, I'll sell it to you for $50. But you're pulling it." The next morning, I was there when they opened. The salvage yard was a graveyard of giants, old Caterpillar dozers, worn-out Euclid scrapers, and there, in the back corner, was the rusted-out carcass of a big bud, even older than mine. It took me 3 hours of wrestling with greasy, grime-caked fittings in a space barely big enough for my shoulders. I had to use a 3-foot pipe wrench and a sledgehammer to break the nuts loose. By the time I was done, I was covered head to toe in a mixture of dirt, rust, and old hydraulic fluid. But I had the hose. Back at the farm, the real work began. I had to drain the remaining 40 gallons of hydraulic fluid from the reservoir. Then I had to crawl back under the tractor, fight the old hose out, and wrestle the new to me, one into place. The fittings were in the worst possible spot, tucked up above the transmission. I scraped my knuckles raw. I cursed the engineers in Havre, Montana. I cursed myself for buying the damned thing. Right in the middle of it, as I was lying on my back with hydraulic fluid dripping on my face, I heard a vehicle slow down on the road. I slid out from under the tractor and saw Dale Peterson's new 4-wheel drive John Deere 8630 idling on the shoulder. He'd traded up again. He just sat there in his climate-controlled cab, looking out over the field at my dead tractor and me, a greasy mess beside it. He didn't wave, he just shook his head slowly, a pitying little smile on his face, and then drove on. In that moment, I felt a hot flash of shame and anger. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool. It took me another full day to get it all back together, refill the system with fresh fluid, and bleed the air out of the lines. When I finally climbed back into the cab and turned the key, the big Cummins roared to life. I worked the steering wheel back and forth, then lifted the disc out of the ground. Everything worked. I sat there for a long moment, the engine rumbling beneath me, and a wave of satisfaction washed over me that was so profound it almost brought tears to my eyes. I had done it. I hadn't called a mechanic. I hadn't paid a dealer $100 an hour. I had faced the beast and won. I lost 2 days of prime planting time, and my corn went in a little late that year. My yields were down about 5 bushels to the acre compared to Dale's. At the coffee shop, the story of my breakdown became a local legend, proof of Art Jensen's folly. But every time I looked at that big bud, I didn't see a liability. I saw a testament to self-reliance. The years ticked by. The mid-70s were a golden age for American agriculture. The grain kept flowing, prices stayed strong, and land values went through the roof. It seemed like the party would never end. A kind of madness swept through the farmlands. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly behaving like high-rolling speculators. The banks were encouraging it, handing out money with a smile. "You farmers are land rich," the loan officers would say. "Use that equity, get bigger or get out." Dale Peterson became the poster boy for the new era. He used his rapidly appreciating land as collateral to buy the quarter section next to him, paying a price that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. Then he bought another 80. He put up a new harvestor silo and a massive Morton machine shed that dwarfed his own house. His line of equipment was a sight to behold. He traded his 8630 for a brand new 8640, the latest and greatest from John Deere, a 275 horsepower articulated giant with every option imaginable. He bought a new 12-row planter and a new 8-row corn head for his combine. His farm was a perfectly matched, gleaming green fleet. He was featured in the local paper, hailed as a visionary, a man with the courage to grow. Meanwhile, I plodded along. The profits from those good years were real, and I was tempted, I'll admit it. It was hard not to get caught up in the frenzy. I'd see the new equipment at the state fair and feel a pang of envy. But something held me back. I'd sit at my kitchen table with Helen, going over the books. We could afford to buy the 80 acres that came up for sale down the road, but we'd have to borrow. We'd have to take on a mortgage, and the interest rates were already starting to creep up. "It just doesn't pencil out, Helen," I'd say, tapping the calculator. "The payments would be more than that land could ever hope to produce." "Then we don't buy it," she'd say simply. She trusted me. Instead of buying more land, I put our money back into the land we already had. I spent a small fortune on pattern tiling our wettest fields, laying thousands of feet of plastic pipe to improve the drainage. It was a huge, expensive job. My neighbors saw the backhoes digging trenches all summer and shook their heads. Dale told someone at the co-op that I was burying my money in the ground where no one could see it. He was right, no one could see it. But the next spring, when we got a 6-inch rain, my fields were ready to plant in 3 days, while theirs were still ponds. I bought a newer combine, a used Gleaner L2, after my old Model F finally gave up the ghost. It was 5 years old, but the previous owner had been meticulous. I paid cash. I rebuilt the engine in my 4020 myself, putting in new sleeves, pistons and bearings, giving that faithful old tractor another 20 years of life. And the big bud. It mostly sat. I used it for a week or 2 in the fall for deep ripping the soil, and maybe a few days in the spring if the ground was unusually tough. The rest of the year, it stayed parked in the back of my old wooden machine shed. The sun faded its paint even more. A fine layer of dust and chaff settled over its broad hood. The tires, still holding air, slowly sank into the dirt floor. It became a joke around the county. Art's giant paperweight, they called it. Dale would drive by and see it sitting there, a sleeping, forgotten giant, and I know he saw it as the ultimate symbol of my failure to keep up, my lack of ambition. The decade was drawing to a close. It was the fall of 1979. I was in the shop, tuning up the combine for harvest. The radio was on, murmuring in the background. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a fellow named Paul Volcker. He was talking about fighting inflation and monetary discipline. Then he mentioned interest rates. They were already at 12%, and he said they were going higher. Much higher. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was the same feeling a man gets when he sees a greenish tint in the clouds to the west. A storm was coming. A few weeks later, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union because of their invasion of Afghanistan. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. I saw Dale at the elevator a few days later. He was unloading corn, his face flushed with anger. "This is just politics," he spat, kicking a tire on his grain truck. "It'll blow over. Prices always come back. A smart man buys when everyone else is scared." I heard later that he'd gone straight from the elevator to the bank and borrowed more money to buy his neighbor's farm, the man having lost his nerve. That winter was long and cold. The news on the radio got worse and worse. Interest rates kept climbing, like a fever that wouldn't break. 15%, 18%, 20%. The numbers were so high they didn't seem real. I spent most of my days in the machine shed, working on my equipment, getting ready for a spring that felt full of dread. One afternoon, I walked to the back of the shed. The air was still and cold, smelling of old oil and dry dirt. I stopped in front of the big bud. In the dim light, it looked even bigger, like some prehistoric beast hibernating. I ran my hand along the massive front fender, my fingers tracing a line through the thick coat of dust. The clean white paint underneath was still bright. This machine hadn't earned a dime all year. It had sat right here, silent and patient. But it hadn't cost me a dime either. No payments, no interest, no dealer calling about a note that was due. It was just waiting. And as I stood there, listening to the winter wind howl outside, I had a feeling its time was coming. The world was about to learn the difference between looking rich and being rich, and the lesson was going to be a hard one. The spring of 1980 arrived with a dry wind that tasted of dust. The rains never came. Day after day, a relentless sun baked the fields, turning the rich black soil into a cracked grey puzzle. Corn seedlings emerged, then withered, their leaves twisting into tight, desperate spires. By June, the coffee shop talk had turned from interest rates to the sky. Men who had never prayed a day in their lives now stood at the edge of their fields, staring at the brassy, cloudless heavens, their faces etched with a fear older than any banknote. The drought was an indiscriminate killer. It didn't care if your equipment was new or old, if your land was paid for or mortgaged to the hilt. But it punished the leveraged man most of all. A man with no payments could tighten his belt, sell off a few calves, and survive a failed crop. A man like Dale Peterson, with a payment book as thick as a Bible, had no such luxury. The bank expected its money whether it rained or not. I saw the strain on Dale first. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a frantic energy. He was constantly on the road, driving his shiny pickup from one farm to the next, looking for hay to buy for his cattle, his tires kicking up plumes of the very dust that was choking his crops. His new John Deere 8640, which had seemed so impressive the year before, now looked like an expensive folly, sitting idle most of the time, its big duals parked on parched earth. The real trouble for Dale started in July. A freak thunderstorm, one of the few we saw that summer, rolled through. It dropped no rain, only a terrifying barrage of lightning. A bolt struck the big transformer at the end of Dale's lane, sending a power surge through his entire operation. It fried the electronic monitoring system in his harvester silo, and worse, it did something strange to his 8640. He tried to start it the next day to cultivate what was left of his soybeans, and nothing happened. The dash lights flickered weakly, then died. It wasn't the battery. He called the dealer, and they sent out their top mechanic, a young kid barely out of tech school. The kid spent 2 days with a truck full of diagnostic equipment, hooking up wires and staring at oscilloscopes. The bill for the service call alone was over $500. The diagnosis was grim. The surge had scrambled the tractor's electronic brain, the complex web of circuit boards and sensors that controlled everything from the transmission shift points to the hydraulic flow. The parts would have to be special ordered from the factory in Waterloo. The estimated repair cost was $7,000, and it would take at least 3 weeks. Dale was apoplectic. I heard him yelling at the dealership manager over the phone from the co-op office. $7,000? For what? A little box of wires. I've got a payment on that machine bigger than my house payment, and it's nothing but a $200,000 lawn ornament. He ended up having to hire a neighbor to finish his cultivating. It was a bitter pill for him to swallow. While his technological marvel sat dead in its shed, my old 4020, with its simple diesel engine and mechanical linkages that a man could fix with a wrench and common sense, chugged away reliably day after day. That fall, the yields were a catastrophe. I brought in 60 bushels of corn to the acre, less than half of a normal year. But my costs were low. I didn't have to buy much fuel since there was so little crop to harvest, and my only major expense was the property tax. For Dale, it was a bloodbath. He had 60 bushel corn, but he had the input costs and the machinery payments for a 150 bushel crop. The math was brutal and unforgiving. The first crack in his empire appeared that winter. A local trucking firm put a lien on his grain checks at the elevator for an unpaid freight bill. It was a small amount, only a few $1,000s, but the news spread through the county like fire in a dry field. Dale Peterson, the progressive farmer, the man who was too big to fail, couldn't pay his bills. The whispers started. Men who had once listened to his advice with envy now spoke of him with a mixture of pity and a grim, self-serving satisfaction. The king was stumbling. The drought broke the next spring, but the economy didn't. The grain embargo held, prices stayed in the gutter, and Paul Volcker's war on inflation pushed the prime interest rate to an unbelievable 21.5%. Any farmer with an operating loan was being bled dry. The bankers who had been so eager to lend money just a few years before, patting farmers on the back and calling them the backbone of America, had changed their tune. Their faces were now hard, their words clipped. They talked about non-performing assets and loan restructuring. It was a cold, sterile language for the act of breaking a man's spirit and taking his home. The farm auctions started in the fall of '81 and became a plague by '82. Every week, it seemed, another family was being sold out. The Miller auction had been a shock, but soon they became routine, a grim weekly ritual. We were becoming numb to the tragedy. Dale held on longer than most. He was bigger, and he had more assets to leverage. He sold off his breeding cows, the herd his father had started. He took out a second mortgage on his house. He was a man bailing water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Every move he made just put him deeper in the hole. The interest on his loans was compounding faster than he could ever hope to earn. The end came in the fall of 1983. The bank finally called his notes. The foreclosure notice was printed in the legal section of the county paper, a small black and white box of text that served as the obituary for a lifetime of work. The day of his auction was cold and grey, much like the day of the Miller sale a year earlier. But this felt different. This was personal. Dale had been our yardstick, the man we all measured ourselves against. To see him broken was to see our own vulnerability laid bare. The crowd was quieter, the mood more somber. There were no predators here, no men with new money swagger. There were just worried farmers, watching a man's life being dismantled piece by piece and wondering who would be next. I stood near the back, just as before. Helen had wanted to stay home, but I told her we had to be there. Not to gloat, but to bear witness. Dale stood on the porch with his wife, looking gaunt and aged. He wore a clean work shirt, but his eyes were hollow. He tried to maintain a look of defiance, but his shoulders were slumped in defeat. The auctioneer started with the small items, but the crowd was waiting for the main event. The big iron. The gleaming fleet of green machinery that had been Dale's pride and joy. The John Deere 8640 was first. It had been repaired, but the story of its failure was well known. It looked magnificent, washed and polished for the sale, but everyone knew it was a Trojan horse, beautiful on the outside, but filled with ruin. The bidding was slow, hesitant. It finally sold for less than half of what Dale still owed on it. The banker standing next to the auctioneer made a note on his clipboard, his face impassive. Then came the combine, the planter, the disc. Each sale was another blow, another piece of Dale's identity stripped away and sold to the lowest bidder. He didn't watch. He just stared out over the heads of the crowd at the empty fields beyond. Finally, the auctioneer announced they would be selling the land. 480 acres to be offered in 3 parcels. The home quarter, the 80 to the north, and the 160 he had bought during the boom years. This was the final, deepest cut. A man can lose his machinery and still be a farmer. But when he loses his land, he loses his soul. A lawyer from a big corporate farm in Iowa started the bidding on the home quarter. The 160 acres where Dale's house and buildings stood. The land his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. The price climbed quickly, but it was just the lawyer and a couple of local investors. It looked like the land was going to be swallowed by an anonymous entity from out of state. I felt a nudge in my ribs. It was Helen. She looked at me, her eyes clear and steady. "Art," she whispered, "you can't let them take his home place." I had never intended to bid. I came only to watch. But in that moment, looking at Dale's vacant stare and the cold, professional face of the corporate lawyer, something shifted inside me. This wasn't about profit or expansion, it was about decency. It was about community. I had spent the last decade saving, living below my means, putting every spare dollar into certificates of deposit at the bank. I knew exactly how much I had. I took a deep breath and raised my hand. The auctioneer's eyes found me. "I have a new bid," he shouted, his voice cracking with renewed energy. The lawyer turned and looked at me, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He raised his bid. I raised him back. We went back and forth, the bids climbing in $1,000 increments. The crowd grew silent, all eyes on the two of us. It was the old way against the new way, the cautious neighbor against the faceless corporation. The price went past what the land was worth in that depressed market, but I didn't care. I thought of Dale's condescending smirks, his talk of being a progressive farmer, and I thought of him standing on that porch, a broken man. The two images warred in my mind. The lawyer finally shook his head and turned away. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot. "To Art Jensen." A quiet murmur went through the crowd. I walked to the clerk's table, my legs feeling unsteady. I wrote out a cashier's check for the full amount. As I signed my name, I glanced over at the porch. Dale was looking at me, his face a mask of confusion, shame, and something else I couldn't quite read. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of triumph. It was a nod of acknowledgement. A nod that said, "I'm still here." The recovery was slow. The farm crisis didn't end overnight. It ground on for another 2 or 3 years, chewing up families and spitting them out. But we survived. With no debt, we were able to weather the storm of low prices and tight credit. The tiling I had installed years before paid for itself 10 times over, giving me a crop in wet years when others couldn't even get in their fields. My old, reliable machinery kept running, and the big bud, Art's folly, became my secret weapon. The ground was hard and compacted from years of heavy equipment and poor prices that didn't allow for proper tillage. I hooked the big bud to a 7-shank V-ripper and went to work, sinking the points a full 2 feet into the ground. The big Cummins engine barely grunted as it shattered the hardpan that was choking the life out of the soil. The next year, the roots of my corn could finally reach the deep moisture, and my yield started to climb, even as my neighbors struggled. The joke about my giant paperweight died a quiet death. A week after the auction, I drove over to Dale's place. He was loading the last of his family's possessions into a U-Haul trailer. He had found a job managing a grain elevator 100 miles away. He looked thin and tired, but some of the haunted look had left his eyes. He saw me pull up and straightened his back, a flicker of his old pride returning. "Come to see the last of me, Art?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," I said, getting out of my truck. "I came to make you a proposition." I told him my plan. I would rent the house and the home farm back to him. The rent wouldn't be cash. It would be a share of the crop. He would be the operator. He knew that ground better than anyone. I would provide the land. He would provide the labor and the knowledge. We could make it work. He stared at me for a long time, his jaw working. "Why?" he finally choked out. "After all the years I gave you hell, called you a fool." "Because this is your home, Dale," I said quietly, "and because nobody knows how to make that ground produce like you do. This isn't charity. It's a business decision. I need a good tenant." Tears welled in his eyes, the first I had ever seen from him. He turned away so I wouldn't see him wipe them on his sleeve. He didn't accept my offer right away. His pride wouldn't let him. But a year later, after the elevator job turned out to be a dead end, he called me. The U-Haul came back down the lane, and the Peterson family came home. The years passed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The farm economy stabilized. Land prices slowly began to recover. Dale and I became partners in a way. He farmed his old home place, and I farmed mine. We shared equipment and labor. The rivalry was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-won respect. We never talked about the auction or the years before it. We didn't have to. My son, Robert, grew up and decided he wanted to farm with me. He was a good boy, smart and hard-working. One of the first things I taught him was how to maintain the old equipment. We spent a winter together in the shop, overhauling the engine on the 4020, just as I had done 20 years before. Then we moved to the back of the shed, to the big bud. Its paint was almost completely gone, faded to a dull, chalky white, but its heart was as strong as ever. "This tractor is the most important thing on this farm," I told him as we stood before it. "Not because it's the biggest, but because of the lesson it represents." I told him the whole story. About the 70s boom, about Dale Peterson's new green paint, about the 21% interest and the grain embargo. I told him about lying on my back in the mud fixing a hydraulic hose while Dale laughed at me from the road. I told him how this tractor sat silent for years, a testament to patience, while the world went mad with credit. "It's not about the iron, Rob," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's about what the iron represents. It represents freedom. Every machine in this shed, every acre of land we own, is ours. It doesn't belong to the bank. When you turn the key, you answer to no one but God and the weather. Never forget that. The moment you let a banker tell you how to farm, you've already lost." Now I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled with arthritis, and I walk with a cane. I spend most of my days on the porch with Helen, watching the seasons turn. Robert runs the farm now, and he's a better farmer than I ever was. He's bought some newer equipment, but it's always gently used, and he always pays cash. The core of our operation is still that old iron I put together half a century ago. Sometimes, in the late afternoon in the fall, I can hear a deep, familiar rumble from across the fields. It's a sound that vibrates right through the floorboards of the old house. It's the sound of the big bud, with Robert at the wheel, pulling the big ripper, getting the ground ready for the next year. He brings his own son out with him sometimes. My grandson, a boy of 10. He sits in the cab, where there was never a passenger seat, perched on a toolbox, his eyes wide with wonder at the power of the machine. The sound of that big Cummins diesel rolling across the land is the sound of my life. It's the sound of survival, of patience, of a lesson learned and a legacy passed on. It's the sound of a storm that was weathered and the quiet peace that came after. And I know, as long as that sound echoes through these hills, our family and our farm will endure.